On March 6, 2026, 8 members of the U.S. House of Representatives sent a letter that should have been routine. Addressed to the Department of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence, it formally requested access to 51 specific UAP-related records, sensor data, intelligence assessments, and historical files spanning decades, some dating back to repositories originally held by the Department of War. The signatories included members of both the armed services and intelligence committees, legislators with appropriate clearances, and legitimate oversight authority. What came back from AARO wasn't a denial exactly. It was something more unusual and arguably more damning. AARO confirmed the records exist. They sit on classified networks. But the office disclosed a critical problem. The 51 files lack verified chain of custody. That phrase, chain of custody, landed like a quiet grenade in the disclosure community. It meant that even though the records are physically present on secure systems, AARO could not confirm who created them, how they were transferred, whether they'd been altered, or whether proper handling protocols were followed at each stage of their life cycle. Without that verification, AARO indicated the files could not be authenticated to the standard required for either congressional briefing or declassification review. The records are there, and they are, in a procedural sense, untouchable. In classified information management, chain of custody is the documented, unbroken record of every person and system that has handled a piece of data from the moment of its creation. For sensor data, radar tracks, electro-optical footage, signals intelligence, this means logging who captured it, which system processed it, where it was stored, who accessed it, and every transfer between networks or facilities. Each link must be verifiable. Executive Order 13526, signed by President Obama in 2009 and still governing classification policy, requires that records submitted for declassification review be authenticated. Section 3.1 states that information shall be declassified as soon as it no longer meets the standards for classification. But the review process presupposes that the material's provenance can be confirmed. No provenance, no review. No review, no release. How do 51 classified files lose their chain of custody? Several mechanisms are plausible. Legacy programs that were dismantled without proper records transfer. Project Blue Book's closure in 1969 left materials scattered across Air Force archives. The informal, unfunded nature of early 21st century efforts like AATIP, which operated partially within DIA but without a formal records management mandate. The repeated reorganizations, from AATIP to UAPTF to AARO itself, each creating transition points where documentation gaps could emerge. And then there's the possibility raised by whistleblowers like David Grush that some UAP-related materials were deliberately held outside normal oversight channels, in compartmented programs with restricted access lists so tight that even standard classification management infrastructure was bypassed. If Grush's 2023 allegations hold weight, some of these custody gaps may not be accidental. They may be architectural. The UAP Governance Board, established by executive action in late 2025, was tasked with coordinating interagency UAP transparency, including classification review. Its mandate explicitly references EO 135226 authorities, the power to conduct systematic declassification review of records older than 25 years and to adjudicate disputes between agencies over classification status. But here's the friction point. The board's EO 3526 authority applies to records whose classification can be validated. The 51 files sit in a procedural no man's land. They're classified, they exist on classified systems, but their classification status cannot be formally affirmed or denied because the originating authority and handling history are unverified. The governance board can't declassify what it can't first authenticate. Congress has tools. Title 50 requires the intelligence community to keep oversight committees fully and currently informed. The FY 2024 NDAA included provisions compelling UAP-related record delivery to AARO. The proposed UAP Disclosure Act, though stripped of its most powerful enforcement mechanisms, established the principle that Congress can mandate record searches across agencies. But none of these tools explicitly address authentication of orphaned records. A congressional subpoena can compel production of a document. It cannot by itself reconstruct the missing custodial history of that document. Legislators would need to either authorize a dedicated forensic authentication effort, digital forensics on the files themselves, metadata analysis, cross-referencing with contemporaneous access logs, or legislatively declare that chain of custody gaps do not bar congressional review, effectively creating a new legal standard. Authenticating the 51 files would not be trivial. It would likely require digital forensic examination of file metadata, creation dates, modification histories, network transfer logs. It would require cross-referencing with personnel records to identify probable originators. It would require classification management officers from the relevant agencies to examine markings, portion designations, and dissemination controls for consistency with the standards in effect at the time of alleged creation. AARO, or the Governance Board, would need authority to compel cooperation from agencies that may have historically resisted UAP-related oversight. And there's a deeper challenge. If some records were held in unacknowledged special access programs, the very people who could verify custody may be bound by non-disclosure agreements that neither AARO nor the board has yet been empowered to supersede. This isn't the first time the US government has faced the problem of orphaned intelligence records. The JFK Assassination Records Act of 1992 compelled agencies to search for and produce records regardless of administrative irregularities. MK Ultra files, many of which were supposedly destroyed, were partially reconstructed through financial records that survived in a different custodial chain. These precedents suggest that legislative willpower can overcome bureaucratic friction, but they also show it takes years and dedicated statutory authority. The 51 files may require something similar: a legislative declaration that these specific records are presumptively authentic and eligible for review, shifting the burden from Congress to prove custody to agencies to disprove it. 51 records exist. The government acknowledges they exist. Congressional members with the right clearances have asked to see them. And the answer is not no, it's we can't verify what these are. That answer is either a genuine bureaucratic impasse born from decades of institutional neglect and program fragmentation, or it is the latest mechanism in a long pattern of procedural obstruction dressed in the language of compliance. Perhaps both. The March 2026 request has made one thing concrete. The barrier to UAP transparency is no longer just classification. It is authentication, the government's ability or willingness to vouch for its own records. Until that barrier is addressed by legislation, executive action, or both, the 51 files will remain exactly where they are, present on the network, inaccessible in practice. And that gap between existence and access may be the most important space in the entire disclosure debate.